Hello and welcome to my channel. This is going to be a mountain landscape with an old wooden cabin, and I'm going to use colored pencils on clear gesso. This is my paper. It's been primed with clear gesso. It has a nice tooth. I'm also going to have to sharpen at least some of my pencils before I start with the sketch. And I like to use a Faber-Castell handheld sharpener. As for the pencils, I'm using Faber-Castell Polychromos colored pencils, and the paper is a Fabriano drawing paper, about 200 GSM, and the size of the paper is about 4 times 5 inches, maybe 6 inches, so it's going to be a smaller piece. Now as for the composition, like many landscape drawings, it's going to be divided roughly into, let's say, 3 parts. The first one here at the bottom, about 1/3 of the height of the paper, that's going to be this meadow in the foreground. And then I'm going to have some mountains in the background. I'm going to try to stack them one in front of the other to create a feeling of depth and distance. Here at the top, I'm going to draw the sky, and I'm going to use some duller greyish tones. I started with a light cool grey, or a light cold grey, whatever you want to call it, and I'm going to mix in some blues with that. I put in a little bit of sky blue and a bit of light phthalo blue, and then I did some blending with my finger. Because on this surface you can actually blend with your finger, because it's a rough surface that creates a bit of residue. So colored pencils behave quite differently on this surface than they do on regular paper. Now sometimes when you want to smooth things a little bit and blend a little bit without using blending tools, you can also use a lighter colored pencil on top of the darker ones, and that'll muddy things a little bit and blend it. So I'm moving downwards, drawing more of these mountains in the distance, and the further they are away from our viewpoint, the lighter they're going to be, and the less vibrant the colors will be. So the mountains, which are all the way back, are just a little bit darker than the sky, and also kind of dull bluish color. Now here for this mountain, which is in front of that one, I'm going to use a more vibrant, warmer, darker blue color. I mostly used light phthalo blue and a little bit of Prussian blue, just to make that a bit darker, to make it stand out against the mountains which are further back. After that, again, I did some blending with my finger, and I cleaned up the edges using these grey pencils. I also put a touch of slightly darker grey pencil on top of that mountain to make it a little bit duller. Now another mountain ridge, or a mountain, or a group of mountains in front of this one, is going to be a little bit darker. Because it's closer to us and it's going to be more defined. So every peak that is closer to us, every peak that is in front of the ones behind, is going to be getting darker and more vibrant in color, and also more defined in terms of detail. So you can see that on top of this one, I created some suggestions of some distant trees, because these tops of mountains, these hills, are covered with some trees. So the ones behind this were too far away to discern any details, but here we can already see some suggestions of trees, or groups of trees. I also noticed that I left one part of that slope a little bit bare, like it's not covered with trees. So I want to have a little bit of variation in terms of the distribution of those trees. But the general idea, like I said, is for the mountain peaks which are closer to us to be darker, because I'm trying to imitate the atmospheric effect where things, when you look into the distance, things get duller and they sort of fade into the distance, becoming lighter and lighter and kind of more bluish and grayish, I suppose. Here for this one I also added a touch of green here and there because it's a little bit closer to our viewpoint, so the colors are going to be getting a little bit more vibrant. And I also put in some suggestions of some shadow areas between larger groups of trees. And now I'm moving closer to this slope here, which is, let's say, in the midground. And because the background color, the color of my paper is a little bit too light, I put down a little bit of raw umber just to get a little bit of variation and make it a bit darker. After that, I started drawing some distant trees on top of that hill. And these are very, very far away. That's why they're going to be so small that you can barely discern their shapes. But I still want to draw small conical shapes that kind of look like pine trees as seen from a distance. Here in the closer to the foreground, I can draw larger and more defined shapes like this one all the way on the right, where I used a little bit of warmer green, which is chromium green opaque, which has a little bit of a yellowish component to it, and then I put a black colored pencil on top of that to create a little bit of texture and some suggestion of shadow areas. I'm also going to have some trees here at the foot of that hill. Again, I'm going to use a black colored pencil for some of the shadow areas. Now, this whole large slope in the middle is going to be partly covered with trees, groups of trees, coniferous trees, lots of them. But I don't want all of it to be covered with trees, which is why I'm not going to cover everything with this dark green. Instead, I'll try to create patches of trees here and there. Some of them are going to be larger groups, larger clusters of trees, and others are going to be very small, and here and there will also be some lone single trees. So this process will take a little bit of time because I want it to look convincing. I can't just cover everything with green. I can do that with some of these areas, larger areas, but I want these larger areas which are covered with trees to be interrupted by some of these bare parts of the mountain which aren't covered with trees. And those are the parts of the drawing where I will allow the background color of the paper to show through, to suggest to the viewer that these are parts of the mountain where there simply are no trees. In between those green or dark green segments, I will also make some shadow areas using some darker colors like a black colored pencil or a dark sepia here and there, to create some variation in terms of value and to break up those larger shapes, larger green shapes, into some slightly smaller shapes, smaller clusters of trees, so that the viewer could have an impression like they're looking at something complex, something that consists of many smaller shapes. Here at the top I just want some of these trees kind of looming over the top of the hill. And here, just to the right of the middle, I'm going to draw or sketch out the shape of that cabin, because I'm going to want to work around it. And I want it to be of decent size, so I want this to be one of the larger elements in my drawing, because it's almost going to be like a foreground interest. But it's not exactly in the foreground, it's more like the midground, I suppose. It's relatively close to the foreground, it's definitely in front of all the other hills and mountain peaks. And it's also going to serve me well to convey that feeling of depth, to convey that distance to the viewer. Right now I'm still refining the appearance of that mountain slope behind the cabin by adding lots of smaller shapes of trees. You see that I mostly just draw small vertical shapes that kind of look like distant trees on the side of the mountain. I'm using a couple of different greens, some slightly cooler, some slightly warmer, some a bit lighter, some of them are a little bit darker. The darkest one that I'm using is, and the darkest one that I have, I think, is the chrome oxide green. It's a very dark green. I can use it for some of the darker shapes and for some of the shadow areas between those trees when I want to break up those large groups of trees into smaller clusters. Another trick that I'm using here is I'm using this light blue color. This is light ultramarine, I think, or a sky blue color, I'm not really sure. But I'm using it to make everything not just bluish, but also a bit more blurry. So when I just drag my pencil on top of these darker green areas, when I drag this lighter blue pencil on top of that, that has two effects. First, it makes everything a bit more bluish, because like I said, I'm trying to imitate that atmospheric effect where I want some slightly cooler, duller and more bluish tones in the distance. And another thing that it's doing, it's softening that texture, because this surface produces a lot of texture. And what you want to do is you want to soften the texture of those objects which are further back in the distance, because the stuff in the foreground is going to be a lot more detailed. You can feel that when you're looking at landscapes in real life, when you're looking at things in nature. The stuff that is closer to you is much more detailed, whereas the mountains, the hills, which are further back, they're a lot less detailed, and everything becomes kind of less defined and more blurry. So you can imitate that effect by dragging the lighter pencil on top of the darker values. As I'm approaching the foreground, I'm drawing some more larger trees and darker trees, which have a lot more contrast and texture and are a lot more defined in terms of details. And now it's time to move on to this cabin. I'm going to start by putting down some of the darker shadow areas using the black colored pencil, because there's going to be a little bit of shadow here under the roof, and the light source is coming from above. It's above the and it's casting all of the shadows down, but the light source is also more on the left, so there's going to be more shadow to the right. Now I want to create some suggestions of some smaller, darker shapes so that this cabin would appear a little bit more complex, but I also want it to look old and somewhat dilapidated. So I'm just going to throw in a few smaller details here and there. And by the way, for the cabin I mostly used a combination of a couple of different greys, mostly darker warm grey and a couple of lighter warm greys, and of course a black colored pencil. Now, in addition to the Faber-Castell black colored pencil, I also like to use a Kohinoor silky black pencil, which is just a little bit darker than the Faber-Castell, and it's also darker when you put it on top of lighter layers. So I use that when I want some deeper, darker tones. So I think the cabin now stands out nicely against that, against those mountains and against that background. And now I'm going to be moving on to this foreground area, which is just going to be like a grassy area, like a meadow, stretching out in front of that cabin, with a few smaller details like some clumps of grass here and there, and maybe a couple of scattered trees. So I'm going to do that now. And I want to keep this light yellowish, dull yellowish tone of the background color of my paper, because I want it to look like dry grass in summer. And to break up the monotony of that color, I'm just going to introduce some more greenish tones by using May green color. And then I'm going to draw some wooden poles here. It's going to be like a small wooden fence, which is also kind of old and partly broken in places. And of course, some of these wooden poles which are closer to us are supposed to be larger and taller, and also further, with a little bit more space in between. And the further you look into the distance, they're going to be getting smaller and smaller because of the perspective. And of course the distance between them is going to be getting smaller. Now I'm going to add a little bit more variation to the terrain by adding some random bushes, maybe some clusters of grass or some clumps of grass here and there, some dips in the terrain and things like that, just to make the foreground a bit more interesting and to have more detail and more texture in that foreground, because after all it is the foreground, so it needs to be a bit more detailed. And I'm also going to add a couple of smaller, shorter, younger trees here, small pine trees in the foreground. I'm going to put one here to the right. I used green first. I used that chrome oxide green, and then a little bit of black colored pencil on top. I'm not going to try to cover all of it, just a little bit in between those larger branches or clusters of needles, just to create some shadow areas and a little bit of shadow under the tree, to give a little bit more depth to that canopy and make it look more three-dimensional. And there's another tree here to the left. This one is going to be just a little bit larger and taller, but this is also maybe a smaller, younger tree. And again, I'm using a black colored pencil to refine its shape, add a little bit of texture, and add some of those shadow areas. And now my foreground is mostly done. I can also add some lighter shapes to those trees. And here I decided to change the shape of of those mountains in the back just a little bit, because I didn't like the shape. So now I think it's better and the drawing is finished, so I put my signature in the lower right corner. And there it is. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe, and if you want to see longer videos, check out my Patreon. I'm gonna see you in the next one. Bye.